Um, I mentioned at the start, we've just surpassed the 1 year anniversary of the Kabul evacuation. How on earth was the Taliban able to defeat the most sophisticated army on the planet? A war which the US spent $2.5 trillion over 20 years.
It's a lot of the times there's no easy explanation to explain how that happened and
Mm,
why didn't we see it coming. So there's two answers. One, we sort of saw it coming. And the second answer is the commitment. We didn't go to Afghanistan to basically off the bat, we're like, we're going to be here for our longest war. We're going to be here for 20 years.
mm,
And we're going to spend this much money and we're going to rebuild Afghanistan. We went there and we were like, okay, post 9/11, we want to go and eradicate Al Qaeda and kill bin Laden, right? And we're like, okay, it's the most sophisticated military in the world. We'll go clean it up, kill bin Laden, and be in and out. And that was basically the mentality of every commander, basically in charge of all the entire mission, which was Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation, Freedom Sentinel, that evolved. It was every year was okay that we are sending to Afghanistan is finally going to end this Afghanistan problem that we've had. So it wasn't like, okay, we're going to rebuild Afghanistan and we have a 20-year commitment and we have this much
mm,
money and we're going to do it systematically and we're going to build the army, we're going to build the police, we're going to build the infrastructure, we're going to build the civil society, and we're going to build the government. It was all just, pieces put together, and almost all the time those pieces didn't fit well. So it was like if you had these different organizations that were for security, then you had all these organizations that was and you had all these organizations that was the so-called government, and then you had this private sector up here. So all these four, so they didn't have that understanding and communication. Not only that, but also these organizations within themselves, they did not have that communication and that understanding of how to run a country. They were more like running small organizations put together versus getting that to a big picture and turning that to run the country. So Afghanistan never became sort of a country to basically be run by a government. It was all fragmented small pieces and everybody was doing their own thing. And when things got bad, it was, for example, about 1,700, kilometers in a province. Taliban came, and maybe it was like 200 Taliban. But by the time the message got to the center, it was like, oh my God, it's 20,000 Taliban, and they're about to take over the province, and they're coming to the center. And the morale, that was really, really bad for the morale of the security forces. So
mm.
the different districts and provinces didn't fall because Taliban were this overwhelming force who came and fought to the nail. It was basically they came to the district or the province, and the security forces was basically like had no idea what was their size, what was their strength, and and what were and what they take over. They almost all the time the security forces would have overwhelmed them and overcame them, overpowered them, but that never happened. In some provinces, some districts, the fighting did happen, but in most districts and most provinces, they just fell because there was no central command and control that would that, hey, you guys are going to be okay, you just keep fighting, we are going to reinforce you. So that was another big thing that I just mentioned, that reinforcement, that supply chain. um it's a much bigger issue when the US started communicating with the Taliban, and they came to the table to have talks. One of the things that the US basically stopped was the supply chain. So basically, when the US and the Taliban started talking, there were these private companies who were providing supplies to the Afghan military. The Taliban was like, "Oh, well, you have to stop those companies," and then the U.S. government basically went and told those private companies, like, "Hey, you guys can't provide the Afghan government with resupplies anymore." So when the supply chain broke, there was whatever the Afghan military or security forces had in reserve, they used it all, and then once they were out of that, they didn't have anything coming in for reinforcement. And again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We could be writing books about this for decades to come, and we could keep dissecting this every other way. And I myself wouldn't say that I can sum it up and have the answer that needs to be. It basically broke at every level of government, whether it was the US government or the Afghan government, on both sides. The US government didn't have the commitment. They didn't have people who were committed to Afghanistan for that duration of the time. People went there for 1 year or 6 months or 9 months, and that was their commitment to Afghanistan. And they came back and forgot about Afghanistan. And we didn't have somebody who was like involved with Afghanistan from start to the end. So again, like I said, it's just tip of the iceberg. We're gonna keep writing books about this for decades to come, and almost all of those books are not gonna hit the point because we're gonna write books after the fact. And a lot of the people who are going to write these books and who are going to have the time to write those books are honestly not going to be the right people to be writing these books because, again, like I said, there's no such thing as somebody as an Afghan expert or as an Afghanistan expert. Somebody could spend their lifetime studying Afghanistan, and at the end of the day, they still wouldn't be an expert about Afghanistan. It's such a complicated country. There's so much history. There's so much dysfunction. There's so much disconnect. There's so many different cultures and religions and ethnicities, and putting them all together and then actually coming up with an explanation is next to impossible.
Yes, it's too much to unpack over the last 20 years for someone to claim they're an expert and to condense it down into a book. But on that note, the sentiment in the US and I guess in the West was everyone wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. Not many people were against the decision which Trump and Biden made to initially pull out and pull the troops back.
Yeah.
Well, how was the sequence of events? How did it end so badly that we're in the shit show which we currently face right now in Afghanistan?
Yeah, and I mean, this didn't start overnight. It didn't happen overnight. It was going on for many years, and it basically was throughout Trump's administration, throughout his administration, this was the main issue they were working on. So this was the issue they were mostly focused on. And from taking office to Trump to the end of Trump's presidency, this was one of the issues that spanned that entire length. So Mike Pompeo and Ambassador Zal, who were working for Donald Trump, were doing these negotiations with Taliban, and the Taliban were like, we're just gonna wait. They were like, we're just gonna keep waiting, and just gonna keep waiting and see what happens. And the longer they waited, the more desperate and frustrated the U.S. administrations and the government became, and that was basically their winning point, is to wait, wait it out, and they were patient while the U.S. was not. So they rushed into it. They basically accepted any offer that the Taliban gave them, and it was more like a surrender. It was more like a surrender to the Taliban from the U.S., especially Mike Pompeo, when they signed the Doha Agreement versus pulling out of Afghanistan. That was you simply cannot put it in other words. When the U.S. did the Doha Agreement, that agreement basically gave Taliban they gave Afghanistan to the Taliban. And then fast forward, I took over. Pulling out of Afghanistan has been, like I said, since the day we went into Afghanistan, and about a month later when the Taliban basically left. Since then, it's been on the agenda, has been on the table. It's we're gonna pull out. So every administration, it was on their it was on their agenda that they're gonna pull out of Afghanistan. And then when Biden came, he took a agreement that was basically the most and even the points that were in that agreement, we now come to find out that they're not abiding by even promises that Taliban made. So even those really really terrible agreement that Trump administration had reached with the Taliban, Biden basically honored it, and Biden continued kept on with the schedule of the pullout of the troops from Afghanistan. And the most terrible decision that Biden made was in May, when he announced that the US was completely going to pull out of Afghanistan. And that's when Taliban were like, okay, it's game time. And that's when Taliban basically that's when their 5,000 Taliban were released from prison. And that's when Taliban were like, okay, we're on a timeline. By the time the US leaves Afghanistan, we must take over. We must take advantage of the chaos and take over government. And that's when the propaganda, that's when they started their offensive in all of the districts and provinces. And a few months into that, almost all of majority of Afghanistan was controlled by Taliban anyway, and they were the only places that the government was even remotely uh, um, you know controlling the country was the big cities like Kabul, Mazar, Kandahar city, and a few of the other major cities. Other than that, um, the Afghan government didn't have much control over Afghanistan anyway, to for a longest time.
Listen, I'm no military expert, but telling your enemy the date you're going to leave seems incredibly insane.